Husband left his pregnant wife in the rain for his mistress, but the driver ignored his orders. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across the mahogany table, each shard reflecting the polished faces of New York's real estate elite. Claire Easton shifted uncomfortably in her chair, one hand resting on her 7-month belly, while the other gripped her water glass. The Palazzo restaurant buzzed with the kind of conversation that moved millions, whispered deals, strategic alliances, and the careful dance of corporate seduction. The Meridian Heights project represents more than luxury living. Grant's voice carried across the private dining room, commanding attention as always. It's a revolution in sustainable urban development. Claire watched her husband present her vision, with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. Grant Easton, 40 and silver-haired, possessed the kind of presence that made investors lean forward and competitors step back. But tonight, something felt different, wrong. The innovative use of vertical gardens integrated with smart home technology creates an ecosystem that's both environmentally conscious and financially profitable. Grant's laser pointer danced across the presentation screen. Conservative projections show a 30% increase in property values within the first 2 years. A woman's soft laughter drifted from the corner of the room. Claire's attention snapped to Juliet Mercer, Grant's new public relations assessor, who sat with perfect posture and predatory smile. 29, blonde and sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. She caught Claire's gaze for a split second before turning back to Grant with rapt attention. Juliet has been instrumental in shaping the marketing narrative, Grant continued, gesturing toward her with something that looked dangerously close to pride. Her insights into millennial luxury preferences have been invaluable. Claire's stomach twisted, and not from the pregnancy. The way Grant's voice softened when he said Juliet's name, the way his eyes lingered just a beat too long, the way Juliet's fingers traced the rim of her wine glass while maintaining eye contact with him. It was a language Claire had once shared with her husband, now being spoken in front of her with someone else. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, each slide showcasing architectural concepts Claire had sketched during late nights in her home office before morning sickness and doctor's orders had forced her away from the company. Her company, the business she'd helped build from nothing, where she'd met Grant 8 years ago when she was the ambitious young architect, and he was the hungry entrepreneur with big dreams and bigger debts. Questions? Grant asked, scanning the room with the satisfaction of a man who'd just delivered exactly what his audience wanted to hear. Mr. Henderson from Blackstone Capital raised his hand. The environmental impact studies. Who conducted those? Claire straightened. She'd spent 3 months coordinating with environmental consultants, urban planners, and sustainability experts. Her name should be on every report. Our team worked extensively with leading environmental firms, Grant replied smoothly. Juliet can provide you with detailed documentation. Our team, not Claire, not the woman who'd carried his child and his company's vision simultaneously. Thunder rumbled outside, rattling the restaurant's tall windows. The storm that had been threatening all evening was finally making its presence known. Claire pressed her hand against her belly as the baby kicked, as if sensing her rising anxiety. If there are no other questions, Grant said, beginning to close his laptop, I think we can call this a successful evening. Chairs scraped against hardwood as the investors began to gather their things, chattering excitedly about timelines and profit margins. Claire stood slowly, her back aching from sitting too long, and began collecting her purse when she noticed Grant's phone buzzing insistently on the table. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Excuse me, he murmured to the group, stepping aside to take the call. Claire couldn't hear the words, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he ran his free hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized from their early days together when deals went bad or deadlines loomed. When he returned to the table, his businessman's smile was back in place, but something had shifted. Everything all right? Claire asked quietly. Just business, Grant replied, not quite meeting her eyes. Harold's waiting downstairs with the car. Rain began pelting the windows harder now, and lightning illuminated the dining room in stark white flashes. The other guests were already heading toward the elevator, umbrellas in hand and coats pulled tight. We should get going too, Claire said, reaching for Grant's arm. This storm looks like it's getting worse. But Grant was looking across the room at Juliet, who had gathered her things and was walking toward them with the fluid grace of a woman who never questioned her welcome anywhere. Grant, Juliet's voice was honey over steel. My Uber seems to have canceled. Something about the weather conditions. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed both helpless and calculated. I don't suppose. Claire felt the baby kick again, harder this time, as if responding to the tension that suddenly filled the space between the three of them. Rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury, and another roll of thunder made the lights flicker momentarily. Of course, Grant said immediately. Harold can drop you off. Actually, Claire interjected, her voice carefully neutral, I was hoping we could go home together. I'm not feeling well, and with the storm, Grant's phone buzzed again. He looked at it, then at Juliet, then finally at Claire. In that sequence of glances, Claire saw something that made her blood run cold. She saw a man calculating, weighing options, choosing. Juliet's apartment is closer, he said, still not looking directly at Claire, and she mentioned feeling dizzy earlier. Pregnancy can wait. Medical emergencies can't. The words hit Claire like physical blows. Juliet, whose only ailment seemed to be an inability to arrange her own transportation, was now a medical emergency, while Claire, 7 months pregnant and genuinely exhausted, was expected to fend for herself in a storm that was rapidly becoming dangerous. Grant, Claire began. Call another car, he said, finally meeting her eyes. His gaze was distant, already detached. I'll see you at home. And just like that, 8 years of marriage, months of carrying his child, years of building his dreams alongside her own, all of it reduced to an inconvenience to be handled by someone else. Lightning flashed again, longer this time, illuminating Claire's face in the restaurant's dimming lights as Grant walked away with Juliet, leaving her standing alone beside the table where her life's work had just been presented as someone else's vision. Thunder crashed overhead, and Claire realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was just beginning. What would you do if you discovered your husband was presenting your life's work as his own, while choosing his mistress over you and your unborn child in the middle of a storm? Would you stay silent, or would you fight back? The rain struck Claire's face like cold needles as she stood beneath the restaurant's awning, watching the taillights of Grant's Mercedes disappear into the storm-darkened streets of Manhattan. Her phone screen glowed as she scrolled through ride-sharing apps, each one displaying the same message: no drivers available due to severe weather conditions. Lightning split the sky again, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Other restaurant patrons hurried past her, huddled under umbrellas and racing toward waiting cars. Within minutes, she was alone on the sidewalk, her light jacket offering little protection against the wind that whipped rain into every corner of the covered entrance. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. Claire placed both hands on her belly, whispering soft reassurances she didn't believe herself. It's okay, little one. Mommy will figure this out. But her voice trembled with more than cold. The image of Grant's face as he'd made his choice burned in her mind. The way he'd looked at Juliet with concern he hadn't shown his own pregnant wife in months. The casual dismissal, the expectation that Claire would simply handle herself while he attended to his medical emergency. A car door slammed somewhere in the distance, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps on wet concrete. Claire looked up to see a familiar figure approaching through the rain. Harold, Grant's driver for the past 20 years, his usually pristine uniform soaked through and his gray hair plastered against his head. Mrs. Easton? Harold called out, his voice carrying a mixture of urgency and something else. Guilt, perhaps. You shouldn't be standing out here in this weather. Claire blinked rain from her eyes. Harold? I thought you were taking Grant and... She couldn't bring herself to say Juliet's name. I was. Harold's weathered face was grim as he approached. But I left them at her apartment building and came back. This isn't right, ma'am. Leaving you here like this, especially in your condition. Relief flooded through Claire so suddenly it made her knees weak. Grant won't be happy that you disobeyed his orders. Harold's expression hardened. Mr. Grant isn't the only Easton I work for, and he's not the one who's been kind to my family all these years. He gestured toward the black Mercedes idling at the curb. Come on, let's get you out of this rain. As Harold opened the rear door for her, Claire noticed something different in his demeanor. The usual formal distance was gone, replaced by something that felt almost protective. She settled into the familiar leather interior, grateful for the warmth and the sudden silence, as Harold closed the door behind her. He climbed into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rain drumming against the roof and the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. Mrs. Easton, Harold said finally, his voice careful but determined. There's something you need to know. Claire's stomach clenched. What do you mean? Instead of answering immediately, Harold reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, worn around the edges as if it had been handled many times. He hesitated, turning it over in his hands before passing it back to her. "Mr. Grant gave me this 3 days ago, told me to dispose of it, said it was just old business documents that might confuse you in your current state." Harold's voice carried 20 years of loyalty, now strained to its breaking point. "But I've been with this family since before you two were married. I've watched you build that company from nothing. You deserve to see what he was planning to throw away." Claire's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. Her name was written across the front in Grant's distinctive handwriting, but it had been crossed out with thick black marker. "Harold, I don't understand." "Open it," he said quietly, pulling the car into traffic. "But maybe wait until we get home. Some things are better learned in private." The 20-minute drive to their Upper East Side townhouse passed in tense silence. Claire held the envelope in her lap, feeling its weight like a physical presence. Whatever was inside had been important enough for Grant to want destroyed, and valuable enough for Harold to risk his job by saving it. When they arrived at the brownstone she and Grant had purchased 5 years earlier, during happier times when they dreamed of filling its rooms with children and laughter, Harold walked her to the door despite the continuing downpour. "Mrs. Easton," he said as she fumbled with her keys, "whatever's in there, just remember, you're stronger than he thinks you are. You always have been." The house felt cavernous and cold as Claire stepped inside, her wet shoes echoing on the marble foyer. She could smell Grant's cologne lingering in the air, mixed with the faint scent of Juliet's perfume from earlier when they'd stopped by the house to collect the presentation materials. The betrayal felt layered now, reaching into every corner of her private spaces. Claire made her way to the living room and settled onto the cream-colored sofa she'd chosen when they'd first moved in. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope, extracting a sheaf of papers that made her breath catch in her throat. The first document was a printout of text messages between Grant and Juliet, dating back 4 months. "Grant, the pregnancy complications are actually perfect timing. Gives us reason to keep her away from the office." Juliet, "And the Meridian project?" Grant, "She's too emotional to handle complex negotiations right now. Doctor's orders. We'll present it as our joint effort. She'll be too focused on the baby to object." Juliet, "What about long term? She's not going to stay home forever." Grant, "Leave that to me. I've got plans." Claire's vision blurred, but she forced herself to continue reading. The messages revealed a systematic campaign to isolate her from the company she'd helped build, using her pregnancy complications as justification for removing her from projects she'd conceived and developed. The second document was worse. It was a draft of legal papers, a post-nuptial agreement that would severely limit Claire's stake in Easton Development, citing mental instability due to pregnancy hormones as grounds for removing her from decision-making roles. The agreement was dated for next month after the baby's birth, when Claire would presumably be at her most vulnerable. But it was the final document that made her hands clench into fists. It was an amended version of the Meridian Heights project proposal, the same presentation Grant had given tonight, with all references to Claire's contributions systematically removed. Her architectural concepts, her environmental research, her months of planning and development, all attributed to the Easton Development Team, or specifically to Juliet's innovative marketing insights. Claire leaned back against the sofa cushions, one hand pressed to her belly where the baby had gone still, as if sensing the storm of emotions raging through her mother. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but inside the house, everything was eerily quiet. For the first time in months, Claire's mind felt crystal clear. The fog of pregnancy hormones and emotional confusion lifted, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time: pure, focused anger. Not the hot, destructive kind, but the cold, calculating fury that had once made her one of the youngest senior architects in the city. Grant had made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the woman he'd married, the woman who'd built his company alongside him, the woman who'd kept meticulous records of every project, every contribution, every innovation that had made Easton Development successful. And now she had proof of exactly what he'd been planning to take from her. Claire reached for her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in 2 years. Not since Grant had engineered her sister's departure from the company during a strategic restructuring that had eliminated several key positions, including the legal counsel role Danica had filled with distinction. The phone rang once before a familiar voice answered. "Claire? Is everything okay? It's past midnight." "Danica," Claire said, her voice steadier than it had been all evening. "I need your help." And I think it's time we reminded Grant exactly who he married. Thunder rolled overhead one more time, but Claire no longer felt like she was caught in the storm. She was ready to become one. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Donica Easton Rivera's Brooklyn law office, casting sharp shadows across the conference table where Claire sat, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming. But the documents spread between the two sisters painted a picture far darker than the previous night's tempest. "Son of a bitch," Danica muttered, pushing her reading glasses up her nose as she finished reviewing the last of Grant's messages. At 36, she possessed the same intelligent eyes as Claire, but where her younger sister had learned to soften her edges for Grant's comfort, Danica had kept hers razor sharp. "I always knew he was a snake, but this is next-level manipulation." Claire shifted in her chair, the baby stirring restlessly. She'd barely slept, spending the hours before dawn memorizing every detail of Grant's betrayal. "I keep thinking about all the times he said I was too emotional to handle business decisions. All the times he suggested I should focus on preparing for motherhood instead of working. Classic gaslighting," Danica said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Make you doubt your own competence while stealing your work." She picked up the amended Meridian proposal, shaking her head. "This project has your fingerprints all over it, Claire. The sustainable integration concepts, the community-focused design elements, this is pure architectural poetry. And he just erased you. Can we stop him?" Claire asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Danica's smile was sharp as a blade. "Oh, we're going to do much more than stop him." She opened her laptop and began typing rapidly. "Tell me, do you still have access to your old Easton development accounts? Email, cloud storage, project databases?" "Grant never removed my access. He probably thought I was too pregnancy-addled to cause any real trouble." "Perfect." Danica's fingers flew across the keyboard. "And the original architectural plans for Meridian? Your sketches, research notes, environmental impact assessments?" Claire nodded. "Everything's backed up on my personal cloud drive. I always kept separate copies of my work. Old habit from architecture school." "Smart girl." Danica leaned back in her chair, her expression calculating. "Here's what we're going to do. That presentation Grant gave last night, it's going to be his downfall." Claire frowned. "I don't understand." "The investors loved it. Henderson from Blackstone was practically salivating." "Exactly. And when we prove that he stole intellectual property to secure those investments, the fallout will be—" Danica paused, savoring the thought. "Catastrophic." She turned her laptop screen toward Claire, revealing a legal document template. "We're going to file an intellectual property claim against Easton Development, not just for credit, but for full ownership and control of the Meridian Heights project. With your documentation and the timeline we can establish, we'll prove that Grant fraudulently presented stolen work to investors. But won't that hurt the company? My company too?" Danica's expression softened slightly. "Claire, according to these post-nuptial papers Grant was planning to spring on you, it stopped being your company the moment you went into labor. He was going to use your postpartum vulnerability to steal everything you helped build." Claire's hand moved protectively to her belly. The baby kicked in response, as if agreeing with her aunt's assessment. "Besides," Danica continued, "we're not going to destroy Easton Development. We're going to take it back, starting with this project." She pulled up another document on her screen. "I've been doing some research since you called. Did you know that Juliet Mercer has been claiming credit for sustainable design concepts in her professional portfolio? Concepts that match your work on the Meridian project almost exactly." Claire's eyes widened. "She's been stealing from me for months, and documenting it beautifully. Her LinkedIn profile, her professional website, even an interview she gave to Architectural Digest last month about emerging trends in eco-luxury development. It's all there. She's been building her entire professional reputation on your ideas." The implications hit Claire like a physical blow. While she'd been sidelined and made to feel incompetent, Juliet had been systematically appropriating her life's work to elevate her own career. The betrayal went deeper than just an affair. It was professional theft on a massive scale. "So, what's our move?" Claire asked, her voice steady now, focused. Danica grinned. "We're going to give Grant and Juliet exactly what they deserve. But first, we need to secure your position legally." She pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and began writing. "I'm drafting an immediate injunction to prevent any further use of the Meridian concepts without your explicit written consent. That effectively freezes the project until this is resolved. Won't Grant just fight it?" He can try, but here's the beautiful part. He can't afford to. Those investors he impressed last night, they've already committed preliminary funding based on the presentation. If we can prove the project was built on stolen intellectual property, they can pull their investments and demand damages. Grant would be facing financial ruin and professional humiliation. Claire felt a cold satisfaction settling in her chest. And Juliet? Oh, she's in even worse trouble. Intellectual property theft, professional fraud, violation of fiduciary duty. She'll be lucky if she can get a job managing a food truck after we're done with her. Danica's smile was predatory. The architecture and development community is smaller than people think. Word travels fast about professionals who steal other people's work. A knock at the office door interrupted them. Danica's assistant peeked in. Ms. Rivera, there's a Harold Williams here to see Ms. Easton. Says it's urgent. Claire and Danica exchanged glances. Send him in, Danica said. Harold entered the office looking more nervous than Claire had ever seen him. He clutched a small manila envelope in his weathered hands, his usually perfect posture slightly hunched with worry. I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Easton, he began, but I thought you should know. Mr. Grant is looking for those documents. He tore apart his office this morning, then started questioning the household staff about whether anyone had been through his things. Claire's pulse quickened. Does he suspect you took them? Not yet, but he will eventually. Harold handed her the new envelope. I thought you might need these too. Bank statements, wire transfer records, expense reports. Mr. Grant has been using company funds to pay for Ms. Mercer's apartment, her car lease, even her credit card bills. All of it categorized as consulting fees and business expenses. Danica practically lunged for the envelope, her eyes lighting up as she scanned the documents. Harold, you beautiful, brilliant man. This is embezzlement, corporate fraud. We don't just have intellectual property theft, we have financial crimes. Claire stared at the bank records, seeing months of charges to expensive restaurants, luxury shopping, weekend getaways, all funded by the company she'd helped build, all while Grant was telling her they needed to tighten their belts because of the pregnancy-related medical expenses. He used our money to court his mistress, she said quietly, the full scope of the betrayal finally settling in, while lecturing me about being fiscally responsible and creating a paper trail that will destroy him, Danica added. Harold, how long have you been collecting these? The older man straightened slightly. I've been with the Easton family for 20 years. I watched Mrs. Claire build that company from nothing. When Mr. Grant started, he paused, choosing his words carefully. When his priorities changed, I thought someone should keep an eye on things. I never imagined it was this bad. Claire stood up slowly, moving to the window that overlooked the East River. In the distance, she could see Manhattan's skyline, including the gleaming towers of the financial district where Grant was probably sitting in his corner office, confident that his pregnant wife was at home, docile and distracted. We have everything we need, don't we? She said without turning around. More than enough, Danica confirmed. Intellectual property theft, corporate embezzlement, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Grant and Juliet aren't just looking at professional humiliation. They're looking at potential criminal charges. Claire turned back to face her sister and Harold, her expression calm but determined. Then let's give them exactly what they've earned. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Grant's contact. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered, warm and affectionate in a way that made her stomach turn. Claire, darling, how are you feeling this morning? I got home late. Didn't want to wake you. I'm feeling much better, actually, Claire replied, her voice perfectly pleasant. Clear-headed for the first time in months. In fact, I think it's time I got back to work. I miss being involved in the company. There was a pause on Grant's end, and when he spoke again, his tone was more cautious. Claire, we've discussed this. The doctor said you need to minimize stress. Oh, I think you'll find I'm handling stress much better these days, Claire interrupted smoothly. I'll see you tonight, Grant. We have so much to discuss. She ended the call and looked up at Danica and Harold, both of whom were watching her with expressions of admiration and anticipation. Game on, she said simply. Outside the window, the morning sun climbed higher over the city, and somewhere across the river, Grant Easton was about to discover that the woman he'd underestimated was finally ready to remind him exactly what he was about to lose. Grant's office on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building commanded a view of Manhattan that had once made Claire's heart race with possibility. Now, as she stepped through the glass doors of Easton Development for the first time in 3 months, she felt only cold satisfaction at the surprised faces turning her way. Mrs. Easton, The receptionist, Monica, nearly dropped her coffee. "We weren't expecting you today. Are you feeling better?" "Much better, thank you," Claire replied, her voice carrying just enough warmth to seem normal while her eyes catalogued every detail of the office she'd helped design. "Is Grant in?" "He's in a meeting with the Meridian development team, but I'm sure—" "Perfect timing, then," Claire interrupted smoothly. "I have some insights about the project that might be valuable." She made her way down the familiar hallway, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floors. Through the glass walls of Conference Room A, she could see Grant standing at the head of the table, gesturing animatedly at architectural renderings projected on the wall. Juliet sat to his right, taking notes with the focused attention of someone who genuinely believed she belonged there. Claire paused outside the door, one hand resting on her belly, and allowed herself a moment to study the woman who had stolen her husband and her work. Juliet wore a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, purchased, no doubt, with Easton Development's embezzled funds. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a style that screamed competence and authority, and she nodded along with Grant's presentation as if she understood every technical detail. Taking a deep breath, Claire pushed open the conference room door. "Sorry I'm late," she announced brightly, stepping into the room as if she'd been expected all along. The baby was making it hard to get comfortable this morning. The silence that followed was electric. Grant's mouth literally fell open, his laser pointer frozen mid-gesture. Juliet's pen clattered to the table. The three other team members, architects and project managers Claire had worked with for years, looked between her and Grant with barely concealed confusion. "Claire," Grant finally managed, his voice strained. "What are you doing here? You should be resting." "Oh, I've been resting plenty," Claire said, settling into an empty chair with deliberate care. "But I realized I was missing something important. My work. My passion project." She gestured toward the wall where her architectural concepts were displayed. "The Meridian Heights development." Juliet cleared her throat delicately. "Mrs. Easton, while we all appreciate your historical contributions to the company, the Meridian project has evolved significantly since you were last involved. Grant and I have been refining the concepts to better meet current market demands." Claire's smile was radiant. "How thoughtful of you, Juliet. I'd love to hear about these refinements, especially since I have some new ideas that might enhance the environmental sustainability aspects." She pulled a leather portfolio from her bag and began extracting documents. Not the stolen evidence she'd gathered, but legitimate architectural plans and environmental studies she'd been working on during her supposed confinement. The team members leaned forward with genuine interest. These were people who respected her professional expertise, regardless of Grant's recent attempts to sideline her. "The vertical garden integration system I originally proposed," Claire continued, spreading detailed schematics across the table, "can actually be enhanced with smart irrigation technology that reduces water consumption by 37%. I've been collaborating with environmental engineers at Columbia during my recovery time." Grant's jaw tightened. "Claire, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Nonsense," she interrupted cheerfully. "This is a team effort, isn't it?" Juliet was just explaining how the project has evolved. She turned to the younger woman with innocent curiosity. "I'm particularly interested in hearing about the sustainable design elements you've added. As someone new to environmental architecture, you must have fascinating insights." Juliet's composure cracked slightly. "Well, the core concepts remain sound. We've simply been optimizing the implementation." "Optimizing," Claire repeated thoughtfully. "Could you be more specific? For instance, how did you address the thermal mass calculations for the integrated growing systems? The original specifications I developed required precise temperature control to maintain year-round cultivation efficiency." The color drained from Juliet's face. Around the table, the other team members waited expectantly for her response, a response that would require technical knowledge she clearly didn't possess. That is, Grant has been handling the more technical aspects," Juliet stammered. "Have you, Grant?" Claire turned to her husband with the same bright smile. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on the thermal mass specifications, especially since you were never particularly interested in the engineering details when I was developing them." Grant's face had gone red. "Claire, you're obviously not well. The stress of the pregnancy has clearly affected your judgment." "My judgment?" Claire's voice remained perfectly pleasant, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "That's interesting, because my judgment told me to keep detailed records of all my work. My judgment insisted on backing up every calculation, every environmental study, every innovative design element that makes Meridian Heights unique. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through files with deliberate casualness. In fact, I have time-stamped documentation of every concept in this presentation, dating back 14 months, long before Juliet joined our team. She looked up at the younger woman with mock concern. When did you say you started working on sustainable design, Juliet? Because according to your LinkedIn profile, you were specializing in luxury retail marketing until 6 months ago. The conference room had gone completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Grant's hands had clenched into fists at his sides, and Juliet looked like she might be sick. Perhaps, Claire continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, we should discuss the timeline of this project's development. I'd hate for there to be any confusion about authorship when we present to the investors. Professional integrity is so important in our industry, don't you think? Tom Richardson, the senior project manager, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Easton, are you suggesting there's been some kind of misattribution of work? Oh, I'm not suggesting anything, Claire replied smoothly. I'm simply ensuring that when we move forward with Meridian Heights, everyone's contributions are properly recognized. Transparency is essential, especially when fiduciary responsibilities are involved. The word fiduciary hit Grant like a physical blow. His eyes narrowed as he began to realize that Claire's unexpected appearance wasn't the hormonal impulse he'd assumed it to be. I think, he said carefully, we should continue this discussion later. The team has other projects to focus on. Actually, Claire said, standing up with the same deliberate care she'd shown when sitting down, I think we should continue this discussion immediately, with all the investors present. She gathered her materials with practiced efficiency. I've scheduled a meeting for this afternoon, 3 o'clock. Henderson from Blackstone confirmed this morning that he's very interested in understanding the complete development history of the project. Grant's face went pale. You scheduled a meeting without consulting me? I scheduled a meeting about my intellectual property, Claire corrected calmly. Property that I'm now formally reclaiming. Danica will be joining us to ensure all legal requirements are properly addressed. The mention of her sister's name sent a visible shock through Grant's system. He knew exactly what Danica's presence meant. Claire wasn't making empty threats. Mrs. Easton, Juliet said, her voice shaking slightly. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Claire interrupted, her pleasant facade finally dropping to reveal the steel beneath, was thinking I would remain silent while my work was stolen and my contributions erased. She fixed both Grant and Juliet with a stare that could have cut glass. But don't worry. After this afternoon's meeting, I'm confident everyone will have a much clearer understanding of who created what. She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back one final time. Oh, and Grant, you might want to review the company's expense policies before 3 o'clock. I'd hate for there to be any additional surprises during our discussion about professional ethics. As Claire walked out of the conference room, she could feel the weight of stunned silence behind her. In the reflection of the glass wall, she caught a glimpse of Grant and Juliet's faces. Shock giving way to the first cold touch of real fear. The trap she and Danica had spent the morning perfecting was no longer a plan. It was about to become reality. Claire stepped into the elevator that would take her down to street level, where Harold waited with the car that would carry her to victory. As the doors closed, she pressed her hand to her belly and whispered, Your mother just reminded Daddy exactly who he married. The baby kicked once, as if in approval. The Easton Development Conference Room had been transformed into an arena. At exactly 2:55 p.m., Claire entered to find the space filled with tension so thick it was almost visible. Grant sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his tie askew, a sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Juliet occupied the chair to his right, her earlier confidence replaced by the rigid posture of someone trying desperately to appear composed while falling apart inside. Around the table sat the investors who had been so impressed the night before: Henderson from Blackstone Capital, Martinez from Urban Futures, and Davidson from Metropolitan Development. Their expressions ranged from curious to concerned as they watched Claire settle into her chair with deliberate grace, Danica taking the seat beside her with the predatory calm of a shark that had scented blood in the water. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Claire began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who owned the room. I believe there are some important clarifications needed regarding the Meridian Heights project. Grant cleared his throat. Claire, perhaps we should... I'll be presenting today, she interrupted smoothly, her tone brooking no argument. Danica placed a stack of legal documents on the table with deliberate precision, the sound echoing like a gavel in the suddenly silent room. Claire stood and moved to the presentation screen, connecting her laptop with the fluid efficiency of someone who had given thousands of presentations. The first slide that appeared made Juliet audibly gasp. Meridian Heights, a timeline of intellectual property theft. "Gentlemen," Claire said, turning to face the investors while Grant's face went ashen. "Last night you were presented with what appeared to be an innovative sustainable development project. What you weren't told was that every major concept in that presentation was stolen from its original creator." She paused, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. "Me." Henderson leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Mrs. Easton, these are serious allegations." "They're not allegations," Danica interjected, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "They're documented facts backed by time-stamped records, registered copyrights, and a paper trail that spans 14 months. Claire clicked to the next slide, revealing side-by-side comparisons of her original architectural sketches and the final presentation materials. The similarities weren't just striking, they were identical down to the smallest detail. "These are my original concept drawings dated February 15th of last year," Claire explained, her laser pointer highlighting specific design elements. "Environmental sustainability integration, vertical garden systems, smart water management, all concepts I developed during my tenure as senior architect at Easton Development." The investors began exchanging glances, their earlier enthusiasm cooling into professional wariness. Grant's hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Claire, you're being emotional," he began. "Am I?" Claire's voice remained perfectly level as she clicked to the next slide. "Then perhaps you can explain these." The screen filled with Grant's text messages to Juliet, blown up to readable size. The investors' expressions shifted from wariness to disgust as they read Grant's plan to use Claire's pregnancy complications to steal her work. "The pregnancy complications are actually perfect timing. Gives us reason to keep her away from the office." Martinez pushed back from the table. "Mr. Easton, is this authentic communication between you and Ms. Mercer?" Grant's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Beside him, Juliet had gone pale as marble, her hands shaking as she reached for her water glass. "Oh, it gets better," Claire continued, advancing to the next slide. "Juliet, perhaps you'd like to explain to our investors how you've been building your professional reputation." The screen now displayed screenshots from Juliet's LinkedIn profile, her professional website, and the Architectural Digest interview, all featuring concepts identical to Claire's work, all dated months after Claire had developed them. "Ms. Mercer has been presenting my intellectual property as her own original work across multiple professional platforms," Claire explained, "building her career and consulting fees on stolen innovation." Davidson stood up abruptly. "This is unconscionable. If these allegations are true—" "They're not allegations," Danica repeated, producing a thick folder. "These are copyright violations, intellectual property theft, and professional fraud. All documented, all actionable, all prosecutable." Grant finally found his voice. "You can't prove any of this holds up in court." "Actually," Danica smiled with the satisfaction of someone revealing a winning hand, "we can prove much more than that." She nodded to Claire, who clicked to a slide that made both Grant and Juliet freeze in horror. "Corporate embezzlement, funding affair with company assets, while systematically stealing my work," Claire said, her voice taking on an edge of righteous fury. Grant was also using Easton Development funds to finance his relationship with Ms. Mercer. Apartment rent, car payments, credit card bills, expensive dinners, weekend getaways, all categorized as business expenses, and consulting fees. The bank records filled the screen, line item after damning line item. The investors stared in shock as months of fraudulent expenses painted a picture of systematic corporate theft. Henderson's voice was ice cold. "Mr. Easton, you used investor capital to fund your personal relationship?" "It's not what it looks like," Grant stammered. "It looks like embezzlement," Martinez cut him off. "Criminal misuse of corporate funds." Claire advanced to the final slide, and her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Gentlemen, I'm formally reclaiming ownership of all intellectual property related to the Meridian Heights project. As of this moment, Easton Development is prohibited from using any concepts, designs, or innovations that originated from my work without my explicit written consent." Danica stood, distributing legal documents to each investor. "These are formal notices of intellectual property violation and cease and desist orders." Any continued use of Mrs. Easton's work without authorization will result in immediate legal action. Davidson looked up from his papers, his expression grim. Mrs. Easton, what does this mean for our investment commitments? That depends, Claire replied, her gaze shifting to Grant with cold satisfaction, on whether Easton Development is prepared to negotiate in good faith for licensed use of my intellectual property, or whether you prefer to withdraw your funding from a company built on theft and fraud. Grant's professional composure finally cracked completely. Claire, you can't do this. This will destroy everything we've built. Everything I built, she corrected firmly. Everything you tried to steal while planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. She gestured to the document still displayed on screen. Did you really think I wouldn't discover your plan to use my postpartum recovery to strip me of ownership in my own company? Juliet finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Easton, please, I can explain. Explain what? Claire turned to her with withering contempt. Explain how you built your entire professional identity on my work? Explain how you helped my husband plan to destroy my career while sleeping in my bed? Her voice rose slightly, and for the first time all afternoon, real emotion cracked through her controlled facade. Explain how you convinced yourself that stealing from a pregnant woman made you anything other than a common thief? The silence that followed was deafening. The investors sat frozen, their earlier excitement for the project replaced by horror at the scope of betrayal they'd witnessed. Grant stared at his hands, his empire crumbling around him with every passing second. Juliet looked like she might faint, her carefully constructed professional persona reduced to ashes. Henderson was the first to break the silence. Mrs. Easton, speaking on behalf of Blackstone Capital, we're withdrawing our preliminary funding commitment effective immediately. We don't invest in companies that engage in intellectual property theft or corporate fraud. Martinez and Davidson quickly echoed his sentiments, their legal teams already being summoned to review contracts and potential liability exposure. As the investors filed out, their lawyers already on speed dial, Claire gathered her materials with the same deliberate care she'd shown all afternoon. Grant and Juliet remained frozen at the table, their world collapsing around them in real time. Claire, Grant said finally, his voice broken. What do you want? She paused at the door and turned back to face him. This man she'd loved, trusted, built a life with, only to watch him try to destroy her when she was most vulnerable. I want you to remember this moment, she said quietly. Remember the moment you learned that the woman you thought you could discard and humiliate was stronger than you ever imagined. She placed her hand on her belly, where their child grew. And I want you to know that our baby will never have to wonder whether their mother was capable of fighting for what she built. As Claire walked out of the conference room, she could hear Juliet beginning to cry, and Grant's angry voice demanding to know how this had happened. But their voices faded behind her as she moved toward a future where she controlled her own destiny. The war wasn't over yet, but the first battle had been won decisively, and Claire Easton was just getting started. The morning edition of the New York Business Journal landed on Claire's breakfast table with a satisfying thud. The headline sprawled across the front page in bold black letters. Easton Development in Crisis. CEO accused of intellectual property theft and corporate fraud. Below it, a smaller subheading read, Pregnant wife reclaims stolen architectural designs in dramatic boardroom confrontation. Claire sipped her chamomile tea and allowed herself a small smile as she scanned the article. The journalist had done thorough work. Every detail of yesterday's presentation was meticulously documented, along with quotes from the fleeing investors and industry experts expressing shock at the scope of the betrayal. Her phone had been ringing incessantly since 6 a.m. Reporters, rival firms offering her positions, former colleagues expressing support, and architects from across the country reaching out to share their own stories of intellectual property theft. But there was one call she'd been expecting that hadn't come yet. At 9:47 a.m., Grant's name finally appeared on her screen. Claire. His voice was hoarse, defeated. We need to talk. Do we? She replied calmly, turning to the second page of the newspaper where a photograph showed Grant and Juliet leaving the Easton Development Building, with their heads down, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. Please, not over the phone. Can you come to the house? Claire glanced around the spacious kitchen of her sister's Brooklyn brownstone, where she'd spent the night after Danica insisted she not return to the marital home until the legal proceedings were formalized. The morning light streaming through Danica's windows felt cleaner somehow, untainted by the memories of betrayal that now poisoned every corner of her former life. I'll be there in an hour, she said. With Danica, Claire, this is between us. Nothing is between us anymore, Grant. Everything goes through lawyers now. The drive back to Manhattan gave Claire time to prepare herself emotionally for what she suspected would be Grant's desperate attempt at damage control. Harold met them at the curb, his usual professional demeanor warmed by something that looked remarkably like pride. "Good morning, Mrs. Easton," he said, opening the car door with ceremonial precision. "If I may say so, ma'am, that was quite a performance yesterday." "Thank you, Harold. Any word on how Grant spent his evening?" Harold's smile was grim. "Let's just say there was a lot of shouting, several broken glasses, and Ms. Mercer left around midnight with 2 suitcases and tears streaming down her face." Danica chuckled from the passenger seat. Rats fleeing a sinking ship. The townhouse felt different as Claire entered, smaller somehow, as if Grant's diminished circumstances had physically contracted the space. She found him in his study, slumped behind the mahogany desk that had once made him feel powerful. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd spent the night staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. "Jesus, Claire," he said when he saw her. "Look what you've done." She settled into the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd once sat as his equal partner, planning their future together. "Look what I've done, or look what you drove me to do." Grant gestured helplessly at the newspapers spread across his desk, all featuring variations of the same devastating story. "The company is finished. 20 years of work destroyed overnight. 20 years of my work," Claire corrected. "Work you tried to steal while planning to have me declared incompetent. I never—" "Grant," Danica's voice cut through his protest like ice. "We have the documents, the post-nuptial agreement, the medical evaluations you were planning to commission, the legal framework to strip Claire of her ownership stake. Don't insult our intelligence by denying it now." Grant's shoulders sagged. For the first time in their marriage, Claire saw him exactly as he was, not the confident businessman who commanded rooms and closed deals, but a frightened, selfish man who had overplayed his hand catastrophically. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. Claire pulled out a leather folder and placed it on the desk between them. "I want what was always mine. Full ownership of all intellectual property I developed during our marriage, full creative and commercial control of the Meridian Heights project, and a formal dissolution of our business partnership." Grant stared at the documents without touching them. "And, personally, our marriage? Our marriage ended the moment you left me standing in the rain while you drove away with your mistress," Claire replied without emotion. "These are just the legal formalities. Claire, please. I made mistakes, but we can work through this. The baby? The baby will be raised by a mother who doesn't accept being betrayed and discarded," she interrupted firmly. "A mother who fights for what she's built instead of allowing others to steal it." Grant's phone buzzed insistently on the desk. He glanced at it and his face went even paler. "That's the 4th client canceling their contracts this morning. Henderson's team is demanding a full audit of every project we've ever worked on together." "Funny how integrity matters when money is involved," Danica observed dryly. "And Juliet?" Claire asked with casual curiosity. "How is she handling her newfound fame?" Grant's laugh was bitter. "She's gone. Packed up and disappeared sometime after midnight. Her phone goes straight to voicemail, her apartment's empty, and her assistant said she submitted her resignation by email at 3 a.m. Claire felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. Smart woman. Getting out before the criminal charges are filed. "Criminal charges?" Grant's voice cracked. Danica smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Corporate embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft. The district attorney's office called this morning. They're very interested in the financial records Harold provided." The blood drained from Grant's face. "Harold? Harold has been documenting your financial irregularities for months," Claire explained. "Expense reports, wire transfers, credit card statements, everything you used to fund your affair with company money. Did you really think no one would notice?" Grant stood up abruptly and began pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "This is insane. You're destroying everything over some personal grievances." "Personal grievances?" Claire's voice rose for the first time all morning. "You stole my work. You used my pregnancy to justify stealing my career. You planned to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could take everything I helped build." She stood as well, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "And you did it all while using company funds to wine and dine the woman you were cheating with." Grant stopped pacing and stared at her with something that might have been recognition, finally seeing the woman he'd married instead of the vulnerable victim he'd convinced himself she'd become. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "Catastrophically," Danica agreed. "And now you're going to pay the price for that mistake." Claire's phone rang, and she glanced at the caller ID before answering. "Mr. Martinez, thank you for returning my call." She listened for a moment, then smiled. "Yes, I'm very interested in discussing independent development opportunities. This afternoon would be perfect." She ended the call and looked at Grant with calm finality. "That was Martinez from Urban Futures. They want to discuss funding my projects directly, without Easton Development's involvement." Grant sank back into his chair as the full scope of his losses became clear. Not only had he lost his wife, his business, and potentially his freedom, he'd also handed his biggest competitor the most innovative architect in the industry. "Sign the papers, Grant," Claire said, pushing the folder across the desk. "Salvage what little dignity you have left." As Grant reached for a pen with trembling hands, Claire felt the baby kick strongly as if celebrating. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered softly, "Your daddy is learning that actions have consequences, little one. Remember that lesson." Outside the study windows, New York continued its relentless pace. But inside the room where Grant Easton's empire had been built, the only sound was the scratching of his signature on documents that marked the end of everything he'd thought he could take for granted. Claire watched him sign away his claims to her life's work, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The woman who'd been abandoned in the rain had become the storm that would reshape his world forever. 3 weeks later, Claire stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new corner office in Midtown Manhattan, watching the city pulse with life 40 stories below. The space was twice the size of her old office at Easton Development, with modern glass surfaces that reflected her growing confidence and a view that commanded respect from every visitor. The nameplate on her desk read simply, "Claire Easton, founder and principal architect, Meridian Innovations." Her phone buzzed with another congratulatory message, this time from the American Institute of Architects, inviting her to speak at their annual conference about innovation in sustainable design. She smiled as she scrolled through similar messages from Columbia University, the Green Building Council, and 3 major architectural publications requesting interviews. Mrs. Easton, her new assistant Miranda, appeared in the doorway with a stack of contracts. The Martinez team just confirmed final approval for the Portland project. They want a fast-track groundbreaking to next spring. Claire nodded, placing her hand on her 8-month belly, where the baby had been particularly active this morning. "Excellent. And the Chicago proposal?" "Unanimous approval from the City Planning Committee. They specifically cited your environmental impact innovations as the deciding factor." Miranda's smile was proud. "They also mentioned that your reputation for integrity was crucial in their decision." Integrity. The word that Grant had thrown away so carelessly was now Claire's most valuable professional asset. In the 3 weeks since Easton Development's spectacular collapse, every major firm in the country had tried to recruit her. Instead, she'd chosen independence, founding her own company with the Meridian Heights project as her flagship achievement. "Any word from our friends at Easton Development?" Claire asked with casual curiosity. Miranda's expression darkened. "The bankruptcy proceedings are accelerating. The criminal investigation expanded yesterday. Federal prosecutors are now involved because of the interstate financial fraud. And," she paused, consulting her tablet, "Grant Easton was spotted this morning coming out of a legal aid office in Queens." Legal aid. The man who'd once commanded 7-figure deals was now reduced to public defenders. Claire felt no sympathy, only the cold satisfaction of complete victory. Her office door opened, and Danica entered with the predatory smile that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Sister dear, do you have a moment to savor some delicious irony?" "Always," Claire replied, settling into her ergonomic chair, a far cry from the stiff, formal furniture Grant had preferred. Danica pulled out her phone and began reading from what appeared to be a news article. "This just posted on Architecture Daily. Disgraced PR consultant Juliet Mercer, formerly associated with the collapsed Easton Development, has been terminated from her new position at Sterling & Associates after only 5 days. Sources close to the firm report that clients refused to work with her following revelations about her role in the intellectual property theft scandal that destroyed one of New York's most prominent development companies." Claire's smile was radiant. 5 days. She couldn't even last a week. "It gets better," Danica continued. "Word is spreading through the industry faster than wildfire. No respectable firm will touch her. She's essentially blacklisted from architectural consulting permanently." She looked up from her phone with satisfaction. Play with fire. Get burned. And Grant? Ah, saved the best for last. Danika's grin widened. His legal team abandoned him yesterday when his retainer check started bouncing. Apparently, the asset seizures caught up with his personal accounts faster than expected. The man who tried to have you declared mentally incompetent is now defending himself against federal fraud charges with a court-appointed attorney fresh out of law school. Claire leaned back in her chair, watching clouds drift past her windows. The baby kicked strongly as if celebrating another victory. You know what the most beautiful part is? He did this to himself. Every single consequence flows directly from his decision to betray the woman who built his empire. Speaking of building empires, Danika said, her tone shifting to business. The Henderson Group called this morning. They want to discuss a $50 million development project in Boston, exclusively with Meridian Innovations. Henderson, the same investor who'd fled Grant's presentation in horror, was now courting Claire directly. The symmetry was perfect. Schedule it for next week, Claire said. After my doctor's appointment. Miranda knocked and entered again, her expression mixing excitement with concern. Mrs. Easton, there's a situation you should know about. Grant Easton is in the lobby. Security has him contained, but he's insisting on speaking with you. Claire and Danica exchanged glances. Did he say what about? He seems desperate. Security described him as disheveled and agitated. He's been waiting for 2 hours. Claire considered for a moment, then made her decision. Bring him up, but have security wait right outside my office. 10 minutes later, the man who entered Claire's office bore little resemblance to the confident CEO who'd abandoned her in the rain a month earlier. Grant's expensive suits had been replaced by an ill-fitting off-the-rack ensemble that hung loosely on his diminished frame. His silver hair looked unwashed, his face was gaunt with stress, and his eyes held the hollow desperation of a man watching his world collapse in slow motion. Claire, he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Thank you for seeing me. You have 5 minutes. She replied coolly, not offering him a seat. Behind her desk, the city skyline served as a backdrop to her success, while Grant stood before her like a supplicant before a queen. I need your help, he said simply, the words seeming to physically pain him. The federal prosecutors. They're offering a plea deal if I cooperate with the investigation into industry-wide intellectual property theft. But they want testimony about other cases, other architects whose work was stolen. I need character references, people who can vouch that this was an isolated incident, not part of a pattern. Claire stared at him in genuine amazement. You want me to help you avoid prison after you tried to steal my life's work and have me declared mentally incompetent? Please. I'm looking at 15 years minimum if this goes to trial. My legal team says if I had testimony from the victim, showing forgiveness, rehabilitation, character growth, the victim, Claire repeated slowly. Is that what I am to you, Grant? A victim whose forgiveness you can exploit for your own benefit? Grant's composure finally cracked completely. Claire, I lost everything. The company, the house, my reputation. It's all gone. Juliet won't even take my calls. I'm living in a studio apartment in Queens and working at my cousin's restaurant to pay for ramen noodles. His voice rose desperately. You won. You destroyed me completely. Isn't that enough? Claire stood slowly, her pregnancy making the movement deliberate and powerful. She walked to her window wall and gestured to the city below. Do you see that, Grant? That's New York continuing to thrive without you. Those are projects being built by architects who don't steal from pregnant women. Those are companies succeeding through integrity instead of betrayal. She turned back to face him, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You didn't lose everything, Grant. You threw it away. You had a brilliant wife, a successful company, and a child on the way. You could have been building a legacy. Instead, you chose to betray the woman who loved you and steal from the woman who trusted you. Claire, please. No. The single word cut through his plea like a blade. You made your choices. You chose Juliet over your wife. You chose theft over collaboration. You chose to try to destroy me when I was most vulnerable. She placed her hand on her belly, where their child grew strong and healthy. Now you get to live with the consequences. Grant stared at her for a long moment, perhaps finally seeing the full scope of what he'd lost. Not just a wife, but a partner whose strength he'd never truly understood until it was turned against him. I underestimated you, he said again, the words heavy with regret. Yes, Claire agreed simply. You did, and that mistake will haunt you for the rest of your life. As Grant turned to leave, his shoulders bowed with defeat. Claire called after him. "Grant?" He turned back hopefully, and for just a moment she saw a flicker of the man she'd once loved. "Next time you're tempted to abandon someone in the rain," she said quietly, "remember that storms pass." But the woman you abandoned? She became the storm. After Grant left, escorted by security past employees who whispered and stared, Claire returned to her window. The baby kicked actively, as if eager to meet the world their mother was reshaping. Claire pressed her hand to her belly and whispered, "Your father just learned the most expensive lesson of his life, little one. Never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose." Her phone rang with another business opportunity, another chance to build something beautiful and lasting. Claire Easton had risen from the ashes of betrayal, stronger, smarter, and more successful than ever before, and this was only the beginning. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers as New York's architectural elite gathered for the annual Excellence in Design Awards. Claire entered the gilded space with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged at the apex of her profession, her black maternity gown elegant and commanding, her 9-month pregnancy worn like a crown of victory rather than a burden. "Mrs. Easton," the ceremony coordinator rushed forward with barely concealed excitement, "we're so honored to have you presenting the Innovation Award tonight." The committee was unanimous. "No one embodies architectural innovation quite like you." Claire smiled graciously, her hand resting on her belly where the baby seemed to settle in anticipation of the evening's events. Around the room she could see colleagues, competitors, and industry leaders all stealing glances in her direction, some with admiration, others with envy, but all with respect. "Claire!" Martinez from Urban Futures approached with champagne and sparkling water. "Congratulations on the Time magazine feature. Architect of the Future. Well deserved." "Thank you, Carlos. How's the Boston project progressing?" "Ahead of schedule and under budget thanks to your innovations. The mayor wants to commission you for 3 more developments." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, having your name attached to a project has become the gold standard for investors. Your reputation for integrity is worth more than any marketing campaign." Before Claire could respond, a commotion near the ballroom entrance caught her attention. Heads were turning, whispers spreading through the crowd like ripples on water. Through the gathered crowd, she could see a familiar figure being escorted away from the registration table by hotel security. Grant. He was arguing with the security guards, his voice rising desperately above the elegant murmur of cocktail conversation. His appearance was even more deteriorated than when he'd begged for her help 2 weeks earlier. His cheap suit wrinkled, his face haggard with stress and sleepless nights. "I'm Grant Easton," his voice carried across the ballroom. "I built this industry. I deserve to be here." The conversations around Claire gradually quieted as more people recognized the man being removed from their celebration. Someone near the bar stage whispered, "Isn't that the guy who tried to steal his pregnant wife's work? I heard he's working as a dishwasher now." Another voice added with barely concealed disgust. Claire watched with detached fascination as Grant's eyes swept the ballroom desperately, finally landing on her. Their gazes locked across the crowded room, and she saw the exact moment he registered her transformation. The designer gown, the respectful crowd surrounding her, the obvious reverence with which everyone treated her presence. His face contorted with something between rage and despair before security finally managed to escort him from the premises. The whispers that followed his exit were cutting and merciless. Can you imagine trying to destroy someone like Claire Easton? What kind of man steals from his own pregnant wife? I heard he's facing federal charges, 15 years minimum. Danica appeared at Claire's side, having witnessed the entire spectacle. Well, that was theatrical. Should we be concerned about him showing up places? Claire shook her head, her expression serene. Grant isn't dangerous. He's desperate. There's a difference. She accepted a crystal glass of sparkling water from a passing server. Besides, he just reminded everyone here exactly why they're better off working with me instead of him. The ceremony began shortly after, and Claire found herself seated at the head table alongside the most influential figures in architectural design. When her moment came to present the Innovation Award, she walked to the podium with the poise of someone who had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. "Innovation," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "isn't just about creating something new. It's about having the courage to protect what you've created, even when that means standing alone against those who would steal it from you." The applause was immediate and thunderous, and Claire could see faces throughout the audience nodding with understanding. Many of them had their own stories of intellectual property theft, their own battles with those who would exploit their creativity. Tonight, we celebrate not just innovation in design, but integrity in practice. We celebrate the idea that true success comes from lifting each other up, not tearing each other down. Her eyes found the exact spot where Grant had been removed from the ballroom. And we celebrate the truth, that those who build through collaboration and honesty will always triumph over those who try to succeed through betrayal and theft. The standing ovation that followed seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers themselves. As Claire returned to her seat, she felt the baby kick strongly, as if applauding along with the crowd. During the dinner that followed, her phone buzzed with a text from Harold. "Mrs. Easton thought you should know. Ms. Mercer was arrested this afternoon. Fraud charges in Connecticut. Apparently she tried the same scheme with another firm." Claire showed the message to Danica, who nearly choked on her champagne with laughter. "Juliet got arrested? Perfect timing. What was that about?" Carlos Martinez asked from across the table. "Juliet Mercer was just arrested for fraud," Claire replied casually, as if discussing the weather. "Apparently stealing my work wasn't enough. She tried to replicate the scheme elsewhere." The conversation that erupted around the table was a symphony of professional disgust and satisfaction. Claire listened with detached amusement as her colleagues dissected Juliet's downfall with the precision of architects analyzing structural failures. "The woman built her entire career on lies," someone commented. "And now she's facing criminal charges in multiple states," another added. Meanwhile, Claire is revolutionizing sustainable design and raising the ethical standards of our entire industry. As the evening wound down, Claire stepped onto the plaza's terrace for some air. The city stretched out before her, glittering with possibility and promise. She could see the construction cranes working on her latest project, the lights of offices where her innovations were being implemented, the skyline that she was actively reshaping. Her phone rang with an unknown number and curiosity made her answer. "Claire?" Juliet's voice was barely recognizable, shaky, desperate, stripped of its former confidence. "Please, I need your help. I'm in jail, and I can't make bail. And my lawyer says if I had someone to vouch for my character..." Claire ended the call without a word and blocked the number. She had no interest in hearing the desperate pleas of the woman who had helped orchestrate her betrayal. Within minutes, her phone rang again from another unknown number. "Mrs. Easton, this is Detective Rivera with the Connecticut State Police. I understand you were a victim of intellectual property theft involving Juliet Mercer. We're building a case and could use your testimony about her pattern of behavior." "I'd be happy to help," Claire replied. "Intellectual property theft is a serious crime that deserves serious consequences." After ending the call, she remained on the terrace, one hand on her belly where their child grew strong and healthy. The baby would be born into a world where their mother was respected, successful, and autonomous. They would never have to wonder whether their mother was strong enough to fight for what she built. Behind her, through the terrace doors, she could hear the continuing celebration of New York's architectural community. Her community now, in a way it had never been when she was known simply as Grant Easton's wife. Tonight she was Claire Easton, innovator, entrepreneur, and architect of her own destiny. A gentle breeze stirred her hair as she looked out over the city that had become her kingdom. Somewhere in Queens, Grant was probably lying awake in his studio apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering how his life had unraveled so completely. Somewhere in a Connecticut jail cell, Juliet was discovering that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate gratification of deception. But here, 40 stories above Manhattan, Claire Easton stood as living proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from building something so magnificent that their betrayals become irrelevant footnotes in your success story. The baby kicked one final time as if in agreement, and Claire smiled as she prepared to return to her celebration. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new innovations, new opportunities to shape the world according to her vision. Tonight was for savoring the sweet taste of complete and total victory. The federal courthouse steps were slick with October rain as Claire emerged from the black sedan Harold had insisted on driving, despite her protests that she could manage alone at 9 months pregnant. The media circus surrounding Grant's sentencing hearing had drawn reporters from every major news outlet, their cameras tracking her movement as she walked with dignified grace toward the building where justice would finally be served. "Mrs. Easton, can you comment on your ex-husband's plea for leniency?" a reporter shouted through the crowd. Claire paused, one hand resting on her heavily pregnant belly, and looked directly into the camera with the calm authority that had become her signature. "Justice isn't about revenge," she said clearly. "It's about consequences. Mr. Easton chose to steal intellectual property and embezzle corporate funds. Today, he'll learn that choices have prices." Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed with faces Claire recognized. Colleagues from the architecture world, former clients of Easton Development seeking closure, and journalists documenting the fall of what the Wall Street Journal had dubbed one of the most spectacular betrayals in corporate history. Grant sat at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting public defender's suit, his once commanding presence reduced to the hollow shell of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. His court-appointed lawyer, barely out of law school, shuffled papers nervously while the federal prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 50s, reviewed notes with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Williams." Claire struggled to her feet along with the rest of the courtroom, the baby's weight making the movement deliberate. Judge Williams, a stern African-American woman with silver hair and penetrating eyes, surveyed the packed courtroom with the gravity the moment deserved. "Mr. Easton," Judge Williams began after the formalities were complete, "you have pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges including wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft. Before I pronounce sentence, I'll hear impact statements from the victims of your crimes." The prosecutor stood first. "Your Honor, we call Claire Easton to the stand." The walk to the witness stand felt eternal, every eye in the courtroom following Claire's progress. She settled into the chair with careful dignity, her pregnancy making her appear both vulnerable and impossibly strong, a visual reminder of exactly whom Grant had betrayed. "Mrs. Easton," the prosecutor began gently, "please tell the court how the defendant's actions affected you personally and professionally." Claire looked directly at Grant as she began to speak, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, Grant Easton didn't just steal my work. He tried to steal my future. While I carried his child and dealt with pregnancy complications, he systematically erased my contributions to projects I had conceived and developed. He used my vulnerability as a weapon against me." Grant's lawyer had coached him to avoid eye contact, but Claire's words seemed to pull his gaze like a magnet. For the first time in months, he was forced to really look at what he had tried to destroy. His pregnant wife, brilliant and dignified, speaking truth to power in a courtroom where his lies could no longer protect him. But the professional betrayal wasn't the worst of it, Claire continued, her hand moving to her belly. "He abandoned me, pregnant and alone in the middle of a storm to prioritize his mistress. He used company funds, money I had helped earn, to finance his affair. And when his scheme began to unravel, he planned to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal everything I had built." A murmur ran through the gallery. Even the judge's expression tightened with disgust. "However," Claire's voice strengthened, "his betrayal taught me something invaluable about my own strength. When Grant tried to erase me from my own life's work, I discovered I was stronger than he ever gave me credit for. Today I run a successful architecture firm that prioritizes innovation and integrity. I have contracts worth over $200 million, and I did it all while carrying his child. A child who will grow up knowing that their mother fought for what she built and won." She looked at Grant one final time, her expression not cruel, but final. "Grant's choices didn't destroy me. They revealed me, and for that, I suppose I should thank him." The silence that followed was profound. Grant's face had gone ashen, and his hands trembled slightly as the full scope of what he had lost, and what Claire had become, settled over him like a shroud. "Thank you, Mrs. Easton," Judge Williams said with something that sounded like admiration. "You may step down." The next victim impact statement came from Tom Richardson, the former Easton Development project manager. "Your Honor, I worked with Claire Easton for 6 years. Every innovation attributed to Grant in the Meridian project was actually her work. She was the creative genius behind our most successful developments, and Grant's theft didn't just hurt her, it defrauded every client who thought they were getting his expertise when they were actually benefiting from hers." Statement after statement followed, painting a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple embezzlement. Grant had built his entire professional reputation on stolen work, using his position to take credit for innovations he couldn't have conceived on his own. When the victim impact statements concluded, Grant's lawyer stood to make a final plea for leniency. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges his mistakes and seeks the court's mercy. He's lost everything: his business, his reputation, his family. He's already paying a heavy price for his poor judgment." Judge Williams turned her penetrating gaze on Grant. Mr. Easton, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing? Grant stood slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I know I can't undo what I've done. I betrayed the woman who loved me and stole from the woman who trusted me. I threw away everything good in my life for— He glanced toward where Claire sat in the gallery. For nothing that mattered. His voice cracked slightly. Claire was right. I underestimated her catastrophically. I thought she was weak, but she was the strongest person I ever knew. I thought I could erase her, but she was the foundation everything else was built on. He took a shuddering breath. I deserve whatever punishment you give me, Your Honor. I just want her to know I finally understand what I destroyed. Judge Williams studied him for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Easton, your crimes represent a particularly insidious form of betrayal. You didn't just steal money. You stole dreams, innovations, and the professional identity of someone who trusted you completely. You used your wife's pregnancy and medical complications as tools to facilitate theft, and when your scheme began to unravel, you attempted to destroy her reputation and mental health to cover your tracks. The judge's voice grew harder. However, what strikes me most about this case is not just the depth of your betrayal, but the remarkable strength of your victim. Mrs. Easton has not only survived your attempts to destroy her, she has thrived in ways that make your crimes seem not just cruel, but utterly pointless. Grant's shoulders sagged as the words hit home. The court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will pay full restitution to all victims, and you are permanently barred from working in any capacity in the architecture or development industries. The gavel came down with finality, and Grant crumpled into his chair as if the sound had physically struck him. 12 years. By the time he was released, his child would be in middle school, Claire's business would be an established empire, and he would be a 60-year-old felon with no prospects and no future. As the bailiff approached to take Grant into custody, he turned one last time toward Claire. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment she saw not the confident man who had betrayed her, but a broken human being who had finally, too late, understood the magnitude of what he had thrown away. Claire stood as Grant was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in defeat. The reporters surged forward as she made her way toward the exit, but she moved through them with serene confidence, fielding questions with grace and dignity. Mrs. Easton, how does it feel to see justice served? Justice isn't about watching someone fall, she replied, pausing on the courthouse steps as cameras flashed around her. It's about consequences matching choices. Grant chose betrayal over partnership, theft over collaboration, deception over truth. Today, he learned what those choices cost. What's next for you and your company? Claire's smile was radiant as she placed both hands on her belly, where the baby had begun moving restlessly, as if eager to be born into this new world their mother had created. Tomorrow, I'm expanding into international markets. Next month, I'm giving birth to my child. And for the rest of my life, I'm going to keep building beautiful things with people who understand that success comes from lifting each other up, not tearing each other down. As Harold helped her into the car, Claire took one last look at the courthouse where Grant's fate had been sealed. Somewhere inside those walls, he was beginning the longest journey of his life, 12 years, to contemplate the choice that had cost him everything. But Claire Easton was already thinking about the future. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new innovations, and soon, the birth of a child who would grow up knowing their mother as the woman who turned betrayal into triumph and emerged from the storm stronger than ever before. The rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds as Harold pulled away from the courthouse. In the distance, Claire could see the construction cranes working on her latest project, reaching toward a sky that seemed unlimited with possibility. Grant's story was ending, but hers was just beginning. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Claire's penthouse office atop the newly completed Meridian Tower, her architectural masterpiece that had become the crown jewel of Manhattan's skyline. At 35, she commanded an empire worth $500 million, with projects spanning 3 continents and a reputation that had redefined excellence in sustainable architecture. "Mama, look!" 2-year-old Elena tottered across the office floor, her dark curls bouncing as she clutched a small wooden building block. She had her father's eyes, but her mother's determined spirit, already showing signs of the brilliance that ran in Claire's family. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Claire said, scooping her daughter onto her lap where Elena could safely watch the city spread out below them. "Do you see all those buildings?" Mama helped design 3 of them. Elena pressed her small hands against the glass, her reflection merging with the skyline that testified to her mother's triumph. In the distance, Claire could see the sites of her latest projects: a revolutionary eco-housing development in Brooklyn, a sustainable office complex in Queens, and the international headquarters for a clean energy company that had specifically sought her out. Her assistant, Miranda, entered with the morning's priorities. Mrs. Easton, the London team confirmed the Parliament sustainability consultation. They want you to testify about green building standards next month. And Harvard Business School called again about the case study they're writing on your company's ethical practices. Claire nodded, adjusting Elena on her lap. Her daughter had become something of a mascot in the office, charming clients and inspiring employees who saw their CEO successfully balancing motherhood with global business leadership. Any word on the Grant Easton situation? Miranda's expression darkened slightly. The parole hearing was denied again. 3rd time. The board cited lack of genuine remorse and failure to demonstrate rehabilitation. He won't be eligible again for another 2 years. Claire felt nothing at the news. Not satisfaction, not pity, just the distant acknowledgement of consequences playing out exactly as they should. Grant was serving his time in a federal facility upstate, his world reduced to concrete walls and scheduled meals while hers expanded daily. And Juliet Mercer, still unemployable, the fraud convictions in 3 states pretty much guaranteed that. Last I heard, she was working at a department store in Ohio under her maiden name, but even that didn't last when her background check came through. Elena gurgled contentedly in Claire's arms, completely unaware that her father was a federal prisoner, or that her mother had emerged from betrayal to become one of the most powerful women in American business. To Elena, Claire was simply the loving mother who read her bedtime stories and built block towers with her in the evenings. The intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Easton, you have visitors. Harold is here with some members of your original team from Easton Development." Claire smiled. "Send them up." Harold entered first, now serving as Claire's head of security and still wearing his immaculate suits, though his role had evolved far beyond driving. Behind him came Tom Richardson and several other architects and project managers who had worked under Grant but had never forgotten who the real creative force had been. "Claire," Tom said warmly, "we wanted to congratulate you personally on the Forbes cover story. The architect who rebuilt from betrayal. Powerful stuff. And accurate," added Maria Santos, the former environmental consultant who now headed Claire's sustainability division. "You didn't just rebuild. You created something entirely new." Harold approached Claire's desk with characteristic formality, but his smile was proud. "Mrs. Easton, I have something I thought you should see." He handed her a newspaper clipping from the Prison Reform Quarterly, an article about inmates struggling with depression and regret. The photograph accompanying the story showed several prisoners in orange jumpsuits participating in what appeared to be a counseling session. In the background, barely recognizable with his gray hair and hollow cheeks, sat Grant. The article quoted him. "I had everything a man could want. A brilliant wife, a successful business, a child on the way. I destroyed it all because I was too arrogant to recognize what I had. Now I watch the news and see her succeeding beyond anything I ever dreamed possible. And I know I threw away the greatest partnership of my life for something that meant nothing." Elena looked up at her mother with curious eyes, and Claire folded the newspaper clipping, filing it away mentally as just another confirmation that justice had been served completely. "Mama work?" Elena asked, pointing at the architectural models displayed around the office. "That's right, sweetheart. Mama works to build beautiful things that help people." "Elena build too?" Claire laughed, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Maybe someday if you want to. But you can be anything you want to be, little one. Anything at all." As the afternoon wore on, Claire found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been abandoned in the rain 2 years ago seemed like a different person entirely, not because she had changed her fundamental nature, but because she had discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Danica. "Saw the Forbes article. Proud of you, sister. Mom and Dad would be proud too." Their parents, who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, had always believed in Claire's potential. She wondered sometimes if they would be surprised by how completely she had transformed betrayal into triumph, or if they had always known she possessed this kind of resilience. Elena had fallen asleep in her lap, her small body warm and trusting against her mother's chest. Claire looked down at her daughter and whispered the words that had become her daily prayer. "You will never have to wonder if you're strong enough, baby girl." You come from a long line of women who build their own empires. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Claire's phone rang with yet another business opportunity, a sustainable city project in Singapore that would cement her reputation as the world's leading environmental architect. But she let it go to voicemail. This moment, holding her sleeping daughter while looking out over the city she had helped reshape, was worth more than any contract. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new innovations, new opportunities to build something beautiful and lasting. There would be challenges, setbacks, competitors trying to undermine her success. But Claire had learned something invaluable from her darkest hour. She was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. Elena stirred in her sleep, her small hand clutching at her mother's blouse. Claire adjusted her hold and continued watching the lights come alive across the city. Somewhere in a federal prison, Grant was probably lying on a narrow cot staring at the ceiling and contemplating the choices that had led him there. Somewhere in Ohio, Juliet was probably struggling to make rent on a salary that wouldn't have covered her old shoe budget. But here, in the penthouse office of the woman they had tried to destroy, Claire Easton held her future in her arms and looked out over an empire built not just on architectural innovation, but on the unshakable foundation of integrity, resilience, and the kind of strength that emerges only when someone discovers they have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The storm that had once threatened to destroy her had instead revealed her true power. And as Elena slept peacefully in her arms, Claire smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had turned her enemy's greatest weapon, their underestimation of her strength, into the foundation of her ultimate victory. The woman who had been abandoned in the rain had become the storm that reshaped the world, and this was only the beginning of the empire she would build for her daughter to inherit. 10 years later, the auditorium at Columbia University was packed to capacity as Claire Easton stepped to the podium, her silver-touched hair catching the lights as hundreds of architecture students and professors rose in a thunderous standing ovation. At 45, she had become more than successful. She had become legendary, the woman whose story was taught in business schools as the ultimate example of turning betrayal into triumph. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded boardrooms and congressional hearings for over a decade. "When I was asked to speak about resilience and innovation, I thought about what message would matter most to the architects and entrepreneurs of tomorrow." In the front row, 12-year-old Elena sat with Danica, her aunt and godmother, watching her mother with the proud eyes of a child who had grown up knowing her mother as a force of nature. Elena's architectural sketches already showed the same innovative thinking that had made her mother famous, but more importantly, she possessed the unshakable confidence of someone raised by a woman who had never let anyone diminish her light. "The truth is," Claire continued, "success isn't measured by what you build when everything is going your way. It's measured by what you create from the rubble of your worst moments." Behind her, a massive screen displayed the skylines of cities across the world: New York, London, Tokyo, Sydney, each featuring buildings that bore Claire's architectural signature. Meridian Innovations had become more than a company. It had become a movement that had redefined sustainable urban development globally. 12 years ago, I stood in the rain, abandoned and betrayed by someone I trusted completely. I was pregnant, vulnerable, and watching everything I had helped build being stolen from under me. Her voice remained steady, but emotion flickered in her eyes. That night, I thought my world was ending. I had no idea it was just beginning. The audience was silent, hanging on every word of a story that had become business school legend. The people who betrayed me thought my vulnerability was weakness. They thought my pregnancy made me helpless. They thought they could erase me from my own life's work. Claire's smile was both warm and fierce. They were wrong about everything except one thing. I was vulnerable. And sometimes, vulnerability is exactly what we need to discover our true strength. In the audience, Harold, now in his 70s but still sharp, nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed this transformation firsthand. He'd recently been honored as Meridian Innovations' Chief Security Officer Emeritus, his loyalty and courage during those crucial early days never forgotten. Today, Meridian Innovations operates in 43 countries. We've revolutionized sustainable architecture, changed building codes worldwide, and proven that doing the right thing is also the profitable thing. Claire gestured to Elena in the front row. "But my greatest achievement isn't any building or any business success. It's raising a daughter who knows without question that she is strong enough to build whatever life she chooses." Elena beamed, her hand instinctively moving to the small architectural compass necklace her mother had given her, the same compass Claire had used when she first started designing buildings as a young woman. "Some of you may be wondering what happened to the people who tried to destroy me," Claire said, her tone shifting slightly. "Grant Easton was released from federal prison 2 years ago. He works now as a night janitor in an office building in Albany, a building, ironically, that my firm designed. Juliet Mercer has disappeared entirely from public life, unable to find work in any professional capacity." She paused, letting the weight of those consequences settle over the audience. "I don't tell you this to gloat, but to illustrate something crucial. When you try to succeed by tearing others down, by stealing their work, by betraying their trust, you may win temporarily, but ultimately, you build your success on sand. The first real storm will wash it all away." The screen behind her now showed images from her latest project, a revolutionary floating city designed to combat rising sea levels, funded by a consortium of nations and hailed as the architectural achievement of the decade. But when you build with integrity, when you lift others up instead of tearing them down, when you turn your pain into purpose and your setbacks into comebacks, that's when you create something that lasts forever. Claire's voice grew stronger, carrying the conviction of someone who had lived every word she spoke. To every young woman in this audience who has been told she's too emotional, too vulnerable, too trusting, remember that the same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable also makes you capable of creating beauty that cold, calculating people could never imagine. To every person who has been betrayed, stolen from, or abandoned, remember that your enemy's greatest mistake is always underestimating your capacity to rise from the ashes of what they destroyed. The applause began before she finished, building to another thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the historic building. But Claire raised her hand for silence. She wasn't finished yet. "Elena," she called to her daughter, who looked up with bright, curious eyes. "Come here, sweetheart." Elena walked to the stage with the poise of someone raised in boardrooms and construction sites, unafraid of crowds or cameras. Claire wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders as they faced the audience together. "This brilliant girl will inherit a world where no one will ever question whether women can build empires, whether mothers can change industries, whether someone who has been knocked down can rise higher than they ever imagined possible." Claire's voice was thick with emotion now. She will inherit a world where integrity always wins, where innovation comes from inclusion, and where the strongest buildings are built by the people who understand both strength and vulnerability. Elena looked up at her mother with adoration, then stepped forward to the microphone with surprising confidence. "My mama always tells me that buildings are like people," Elena said in her clear, young voice. "They need strong foundations, but they also need to be flexible enough to bend in storms without breaking. And the most beautiful buildings are the ones that let light in." The audience erupted in delighted applause. Claire knelt down to Elena's level and whispered, "Perfect, baby girl, just perfect." As they left the stage together, mother and daughter, Claire caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the auditorium. Harold stood by the exit, his eyes bright with tears of pride, holding a newspaper with the headline, "Claire Easton receives Presidential Medal for Architectural Innovation." The woman who had once been abandoned in the rain had become someone who reshaped skylines, changed laws, inspired generations, and raised a daughter who would carry forward a legacy of strength, integrity, and unshakable confidence. Outside the auditorium, as they walked across the Columbia campus where Claire had once studied as a young woman full of dreams, Elena looked up at her mother. "Mama, do you think Daddy ever watches your speeches on the news?" Claire considered the question carefully. Grant would be 52 now, his life a series of menial jobs and small forgotten moments. Sometimes she wondered if he truly understood what he had lost, or if he still told himself stories to make his choices seem less catastrophic. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said finally, "but I hope that if he does, he learns something valuable from them." "What would that be?" Claire smiled, looking up at the Manhattan skyline where several of her buildings reached toward the clouds like monuments to perseverance. That the woman he tried to destroy became everything he never had the vision to imagine, and that sometimes, the greatest gift our enemies give us is underestimating our strength. As they walked toward the car where Harold waited with his usual warm smile, Claire felt the deep satisfaction of a life fully lived, battles definitively won, and a legacy secured not just in steel and glass, but in the fearless young woman walking beside her. The storm that had once threatened to destroy her had indeed revealed her true power, and that power would echo through generations of buildings, innovations, and daughters who would never doubt their own strength. Claire Easton had not just survived betrayal, she had transformed it into an empire that would stand forever. Would you have the courage to turn your deepest betrayal into your greatest triumph? Have you ever discovered strength you didn't know you possessed in your darkest moments? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like to help me out, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next stories. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.